is recorded. Yeah, thanks for inviting me and being able to give a talk to you there in India. It's I hope you have a great meeting, and it's great that these new tools allow me to reach you so easily from my own office. It's also a bit weird. I can see you, right? So I hope you enjoy it. If you have any questions, please ask them afterwards. Also, if that's possible in the middle, but perhaps that's not possible due to all the technology. But I hope everything is clear that I tell you. If not, then please let me know when that's possible. If I'm looking to the right, I'm looking at you. So that's, I have a screen over there. But I'll try to look in the camera as much as possible. So at Utrecht University, we study interaction between eye movements and visual working memory. And let me just start off with a short thought experiment. So imagine that you're sitting in a completely dark room, and your head is in a chin rest, and you're looking at a monitor. And on this monitor, objects will be presented. And you, as a participant, know that these objects, they will disappear unexpectedly, and then you are required to maintain the information, and then you will be tested on which information is stored in memory. And when you do this incorrectly, this is considered a mistake. And then the information is supposed to be maintained in visual working memory. But there's something a bit weird about the study on visual working memory if you see it from this way, right? Because according to experimental psychology, the world is like a magic trick in which information just disappears. And that's not like the real world, right? When I look outside, when I look around me, information is stable. Information doesn't simply disappear, right? I close my eyes, I open my eyes, and all the information around me is still there. So a lot of experiments on visual working memory are driven by the idea that information in the world is not stable. Well, actually, when we interact with the world, you can just access information. And this is where you see all the eye movements come in. But let me first describe you a little bit more about visual working memory. Because a lot of the studies on visual working memory investigate information that is no longer physically present. So information is removed from the screen, it's no longer available in the external world, and then you as an observer have to maintain the information internally. Well, this is not like the real world. As I said, in the real world, information is physically available generally. Second of all, studies on visual working memory have mostly focused on sort of the maximum capacity. How many items can you store in visual working memory? And if you do this type of experiments, then you also realize how extremely complicated this is and how effortful it is to maintain all the information in visual working memory. If you ever do an experiment where you have to maintain 4 items in visual working memory, you start sweating and you become really, really tired because this is really complicated. Generally, in daily life, we don't maintain a lot of information in our internal visual working memory. Also, because the world is definitely stable. So what I propose is that if we want to study how visual working memory actually functions, we should take into account the external world and how our internal memory system interacts with the physically present world around us. And I've proposed this sort of idea, this viewpoint, in a short opinion piece in Visual Cognition, where I propose that we should actually embrace an embodied account of visual working memory. And this is where the eye movements kick in, right? I know this is a conference on eye movements, and you have invited me as sort of a researcher on eye movements. But this type of research, it's actually based on eye movement work, because we can access the information in the external world by making eye movements. And eye movements are considered to be relatively cheap. We'll talk about that a little bit more. And you can make them quite effortlessly, right? Nobody ever comes home after a day of work complaining about the number of eye movements they've been making. Like it is something we do just automatically without a lot of conscious awareness and a lot of mental energy required to do it. So the reason why I don't have to maintain an internal representation of the external world is because I can access the information by moving my eyes. And therefore, we don't have to rely on our effortful, unreliable internal working memory, because we can rely on the external world as a way to represent information. So I hope you can understand the embodied account part of this, right? What I really propose is that we don't have an internal replica of the external world. Our internal representation is quite limited because we have our eye movements and we move around our eyes in order to access information, in order to sample information around us. And the visual working memory system and the eye movement system are highly linked. A couple of years ago, I wrote this review paper in which I described that visual working memory and eye movement system is actually part of the oculomotor system. What I proposed there together with Andrew Hollingworth is that every time we move our eyes, you actually engage visual working memory. Let me explain that. So first of all, when you make an eye movement, the target location of your eye movement is determined partly by the content of your visual working memory. So if you have the color red in your internal memory because you're looking for something red and something red appears in your environment, we know that you quite automatically make a saccade towards that red item. Meaning that where you're making an eye movement towards is partly driven by the content of your internal visual working memory. So oculomotor control is determined by the content of visual working memory. Then whenever you make an eye movement, there's a pre-saccadic encoding of the target location, a target object in your visual working memory. So again, I'm making an eye movement to something red. The moment I'm making I'm programming an eye movement to this red item is stored in your visual working memory. And I propose that it's a mandatory process. There's a reason for why the information of the target is maintained in visual working memory. What I propose is that actually during an eye movement, you're blind, and what you then are perceiving is the content of your visual working memory, because this is how the world will look after your eye movement, right? I'm making an eye movement to something red. During an eye movement, I'm blind, which means that perception during the eye movement is driven by the content of your visual working memory in order to make your perception look smoothly. And lastly, you know that the eye movement system is not very accurate. You don't really land exactly on your target location. So what then happens after you've made an eye movement is that you make a corrective saccade based on the content of your visual working memory. So you land not exactly on the right target, and then you just look at where I should have been going. Oh, that's something red, and then you make a corrective saccade to the correct target item. So throughout the stages of eye movement execution, visual working memory is maintained, which implies, if I'm correct, and I think I am, that every time you make an eye movement, you actually engage your visual working memory. And therefore, a very important function of visual working memory is actually your oculomotor control. Okay, but then the question arises, right? Okay, if these systems are so linked, and if it's so equipped to access information externally, then the brain has to make a conscious decision, well, not very conscious, I mean a continuous decision, every time you make an eye movement, about which information to store internally into visual working memory and which information to leave in the external world. So there's a certain trade-off, something I call a perceptual homeostasis, a trade-off between which information to leave in the external world and which information to internalize. And this decision, this trade-off, is governed by a number of factors. And I will present a couple of experiments in which we actually investigate this trade-off. One of the factors that we now know influences this trade-off is the cost of sampling. If an eye movement becomes expensive, or there's a cost associated with making an eye movement, you will lean towards storing information internally, because now this using your world as an external memory is not a wise decision, because there's now a cost associated with an eye movement. One other thing you can think about is when a memory storage becomes difficult, you start to rely more on the external world, but also the familiarity of the environment might determine the trade-off. Very familiar environments will allow you to explore it just based on the internal representation, because you know the environment. And the reliability of the environment, when an environment is unreliable, you might want to rely more on the internal memory, because information might disappear unexpectedly or whatever. Okay, so what type of task do we use to investigate this world as an external memory and the trade-off between internal storage and external access? Well, traditionally, the task that I think is a very, very nice and elegant experiment is the copy task. So the task of the observer is relatively simple. You see a model on the left, and there's a workspace on the right. And the task of the observer is to copy the model on the workspace, simply by dragging the items. And I'm going to show you a short movie that will sort of illustrate how people move their eyes. And what you can see already from this example is that people use the external world as a memory resource. we make eye movements all the time towards the model in order to copy it. Here's a checking. That was a checking eye movement. So let's look at that again, and let's just look at how much information is actually encoded. So there's a one item encoded here, and it's placed. So checking again, one item. The participant could, of course, also encoded more items, but it's just chosen that it's one item. And here you see a checking saccade, and now the information is placed. So you can see already from this that the default setting of an observer is actually to store just one item into internal memory and to use their eye movement system as a way to not load up your internal memory that much. Okay, so let's start playing around with this paradigm, right? Because you probably by now have already come up with a number of experiments that you could do with the copy task. And here in Utrecht, we have lots of fun interacting with this paradigm because there are so many cool things you can manipulate here. One very simple one that we started off here in the lab was with, let's manipulate the cost of an eye movement. So what I mean with a cost, like how do you change the cost of an eye movement? Well, what we decided to do is introduce a waiting time. So every time when people went to the model in order to access information, we had them wait, either short or relatively long. And long here is 3 seconds. And if you've ever been in a lab, then you know that waiting for 3 seconds in a lab during a trial is endless, right? It feels endless. It's really, really long to wait 3 seconds. So it means that every time you now make an eye movement towards the model in order to investigate and examine information, you have to wait 3 seconds. Well, what perhaps not so surprising is that people start to make less eye movements towards the model. And every time they go towards the model, they dwell longer, meaning that they have longer fixation times on the individual items of the model. So here you can see that this relatively simple manipulation of introducing a waiting time of every eye movement in order to access information, we now see a difference in the trade-off, that people start to rely more on internal memory, which means that this trade-off is something that you can manipulate. We wrote up this paper. It's a paper in Cortex, and it's highly reminiscent of earlier work, which it was clearly based on, which I definitely want to acknowledge here, by Ballard and Hayhoe, and also O'Regan, who made sort of the idea of the world as an external memory accessible, and who were the first to actually introduce this idea. But what we do in our lab is we really try to push this further because it hasn't really been studied until the 70s, after the 70s. And I think it's something that's really interesting. It's a cool paradigm, and it's a nice way of thinking about what's actually the function of our eye movement system. But there's sort of an assumption here, like, right? One of the assumptions is that this eye movement behavior will tell how many items are stored into visual working memory. And I've just shown the example, and I seem to imply with my words that there was only one item maintained in visual working memory. Then the question arises, is that truly the case? So think about if you do your shopping and you have your grocery list with you. What happens if you lose your grocery list? So if you're like me, and like a lot of people, you just examine your grocery list one by one, and then you search for the items one by one. But what happens if you lose your shopping list while shopping? Would you come home with nothing rest, that the things that were on the shopping list that you didn't get yet, would they be gone? Or is there still some residual information, and you looking at your shopping list is actually not that necessary because there's quite a good or internal representation just by the number of times you have looked at your shopping list before. So in order to do that, we did an online experiment because this was COVID times, and actually we're still doing a lot of online experiments because they're very well suitable for this type of experiments in order to investigate this question. So here's an online version of the copy task, and let's just look at what happens. We mimic the eye movements by using the spotlight around the mouse cursor, and we know from literature that this is a nice correlate of the eye movements that people would make if you would do this type of task in the lab with an eye tracker. And as you can already see, this is quite sort of natural oculomotor behavior just done by the mice. So people are looking at the model, they're picking up the resources. Oh, I made a mistake. Okay, now placing one item, this person is placing 2 items. Let's go towards the model and check again. But this when the magic happens. So what we did then is when actually people went to the model in order to forage more information, we stopped them and we asked them a probe question. Hey, you went towards the model implying that you wanted to pick up more information, but Let me just ask you, do you know what is here at this location? This is an unexpected probe question in one of 6 trials, in which when people went toward the model, we surprised them and we asked them, do you know what's still on your shopping list? So in other words, is there still information in your internal visual working memory, or was it truly depleted? Was there really nothing left in your visual working memory? So what we see in replication of other work is that people generally place one correct placement per inspection. So people 1.2 perhaps is our median here. So what people place is they place 1.2 items. This is our mean, by the way. 1.2 items, and that's sort of the general copying strategy, replicating earlier work that people only really sort of serially copy these items. But during the probe questions, we could examine if there's truly nothing left when they've actually placed this 1.2 item. If it was visual working memory study depleted before resampling, we would expect performance to be at chance level. However, when visual working memory still contains information before resampling, we would expect performance to be higher than chance. And these are our results. So it shows that people actually have quite a lot of information in their visual working memory, at least enough information to know which item was on that particular location. So although they were not placing the item, they were perhaps not precise, accurate enough for them, or sure enough about the information in order to be placed, there was actually still some information. But still, like you do your shopping list, you still want to check once every while, right? Am I looking for the red apple, or do I need a green apple? And as you're going to look at your shopping list, then you know for sure. Because the information is available in the external world, we just simply use it, although it might not really be necessary. But because eye movements are so cheap, we just use the world as a memory resource quite extensively. This paper was published in Cognition, and we have a whole theoretical model there in that paper that explains sort of the action threshold that might vary depend on the situation, right? If I really ask you to deplete all your memory, or if I punish you when you make a mistake, this is going to change the threshold about when you think an internal representation is actually accurate enough in order to actually place the item. Okay, so an attempt to gain information from the external world does not imply an empty visual working memory. There are residual memory traces that might just not be accurate or precise enough in order for the information to be actually used, which means there's a lot more to unpack than the sample frequency. So this perceptual homeostasis is about how reliable is the external world, how easy accessible is the external world. And this copy task, I think, is a very nice paradigm in order to study it. But there are also other paradigms that could be well used here. And one of them is traditional visual search. Because if you look how visual search is generally performed in all the labs around the world, we remove the information that contains your target template. So in most labs, the template, so the things you're looking for, is removed before search onset. So you get something presented at the screen, search for the letter L, the L is removed, and then you need to start looking for the letter L. But this is again not like how we do it in real life. In real life, we can resample our templates quite extensively if they are available. For instance, the instruction manual, right? If you have an instruction manual, just look back and forth between the thing you're working on and the instruction manual. So when you are rebuilding an IKEA closet, or when you're Lego or playing a tabletop game, you generally can look towards the things you're looking for while you are searching. So this is what we mimic to do. We wanted to create a visual search task in which the external world contains information about the template. So the question arises, do participants actually resample these templates during visual search? And does the amount of sampling vary with required visual working memory load? And is it actually beneficial in terms of speed accuracy? So we used a relatively simple task. We added a condition with one template, and this could be physically present during the whole trial or only at the beginning. And then on the left, we have our template area, which there the thing is positioned to the thing you're looking for. And on the right, we have the search area. And here, there was a target present on 75% of our trials. We also had a 4 template condition in which search is really difficult because you have to search for 4 things, but only one of them is present during search in 75% of our trials. So we have a block design, we have 1 or 4 templates, and we have, crucially, unlimited and limited access. And with unlimited access, I mean that the information, the templates, will be physically present throughout the trial, while during limited access, there's only one glance. So let me show you an example of a one limited trial. People are examining template and it's gone. And I have to do, they're completely dependent on their internal memory because the template is no longer physically available during search. This is a for unlimited condition in which we have 4 templates that are there all the time, which means that people can just go back and forth between their search array and the template area. If they have, and they can decide whatever they want. They can search one by one, they can search in parallel. We let them decide what their optimal strategy would be. Okay, we have 2 experiments in this particular study. We have an experiment 1, which was relatively simple stimuli, land.c, which means that they're quite easy perhaps to encode, perhaps also verbally. But experiment 2, we use more complex stimuli, which are known to be difficult to verbalize. So the first question is, did participants actually resample the templates? And how are we going to measure that? We're going to measure that by using the gaze crossings towards the template area as our measure of resampling, right? So one gaze crossing is going to be minimal because then you actually cross towards the template area. But if there's more than one, that means that during search, you're actually going back and forth between the template and the search array. Okay, this is our experiment 1, which are simple stimuli. On the y-axis, you see the gaze crossings towards the template. And what you can see is that there's a difference between the one unlimited and limited condition, meaning that even when there's only one template, you still check that. And these are checks probably at the end of the trial. We've looked into these, and these are at the end of the trial, in which once you found the target, you just go back towards the template area to see, is this actually my target? However, when we when we have the 4 unlimited condition, meaning that you actually have to search for 4 items, there are a lot more crossings, meaning that now you go back and forth towards the workspace, towards the template area a lot more, which makes sense, right? Because now you're encoding 4 items. It's extremely difficult to maintain in visual working memory. So now you probably only search 2 items at the same time. In experiment 2, you can see that the checking behavior, which it becomes actually quite somewhat more in our 1 condition and a lot more in our 4 unlimited condition, meaning that if you look at the y-axis, this is now 3 gaze crossings towards the template, meaning that people are almost searching serially here. So participants consistently made use, even in a very simple version of the experiment, made use of the ability to resample information. It's clearly moderated by task demands, which is also something you would expect, right? So did this template availability actually benefit performance? Do people get better? On the y-axis, you see the balanced accuracy. And what you can see is a clear difference between the unlimited and the limited condition. Meaning that in the unlimited condition, in which information was available almost throughout the trial, the information was leading towards observer being a lot better. So the ability to resample information benefited accuracy. And the completion time was also shorter when information was physically available. So participants were slower when they could not resample. And if you think about that, that's perhaps a bit weird, right? Because resampling takes time. So wouldn't you expect the resampling to lead to longer completion times? Well, we looked into that and we investigated why were participants slower. And the answer is participants spent more time trying to encode the template. So here we have the template sample duration. What you can see that in the limited condition, the sample duration is a lot longer. And it kind of makes sense. If you look at an example trial, you can see it happening, right? Here an observer knows that the information is only going to be temporarily available, and he's looking at these items very long, like he's almost like holding on to them. Okay, I only have one chance in order to examine these items. So this means that people spend a lot of time actually encoding these items. So there are longer individual fixations. Also on the template area. So the ability to resample provided the option to decrease visual working memory load in the number of items, but also the depth of encoding can be manipulated. So was resampling useful? Well, participants used the availability to verify target absence. And what you can see is that people actually become better in the situations in which the information is unlimited available. So meaning that participants refresh their visual working memory content at the end of the trial. It is also linked to higher accuracy. So resampling was used dynamically and also to their own benefit. So to summarize this, participants actually used the ability to resample these templates, and these resampling, they benefited to accuracy and speed, especially when visual working memory load was high. And it really allowed them, participants, to decrease their visual working memory load. And it allowed sort of strategies where people could delay the encoding of templates and the verification of the existing visual working memory content. People strategically use it to their own benefit. Okay, so this was a study where we showed that also during visual search, you can change the traditional visual search tasks in order to include this external working memory component. We just published this study in Journal of Vision. You can look it up if you're interested. It's called "Don't Hide the Instruction Manual," and I think you can see why we called this, why we use that title as sort of a clear hint to the outcome of our studies. So we can now sort of add the external memory component to all of these studies, but there's one assumption that we haven't really tested yet, which is that I was said also in the beginning, saccades are cheap. But what does that mean, right? You are eye movement researchers, I'm an eye movement researcher. So in my world, the whole brain is almost dedicated to eye movement, the visual cortex, the parietal cortex, the frontal cortex. You've got so many brain areas involved in programming and executing eye movements. Are they truly cheap? Is it so easy for the brain to execute eye movements? If you think about all the processes that need to happen whenever you move your eyes, there are quite some extensive computations that need to be made. So this alludes to a question that I've been having for quite some time. It's actually, when do we decide to move our eyes? And when do we decide not to move our eyes? As you all know, you can also shift your attention covertly, right? By not moving your eyes. But there's therefore a decision to, in some situations, to only use your covert attention, so shifting your attention without moving the eyes, and situation in which you will actually move your eyes with the covert attention, right? There is attention, spotlight shift, and an eye movement shift. But when do you determine what, right? Certain tasks you can perform just as well without moving the eyes than with moving the eyes. So you don't always need your eyes to move towards the location of interest. Some of these tasks can be performed without the high accuracy of the fovea. Okay, so how do we measure this? Well, one of our main outcome measures that we've been highly interested in the last couple of years is the pupil. Because as you know, the pupil responds to a lot of information, but it also is a component that allows us to measure effort. So we could measure by using the pupil how effortful it is to make a saccade and to shift your attention. And as you know, low effort is associated with a smaller pupil dilation, while high effort is a larger pupil. So there you can see that there's a large pupil associated. Sorry, that's a dilation, and constriction is when it becomes smaller. I messed up there. Smaller pupil constriction, higher pupil is a dilation. But high effort is associated with a larger pupil and therefore a dilation. And so cognitive resources are limited, and thus any use of it is costly and likely to be minimized. So here's our experiment. It's a little bit complicated, but let me take you through it step by step. Let me first explain our control condition. So the eyes and the attention is at the center. You can see that we have these objects in the center, and they might change into a target letter. But we will tell you where the target letter is going to appear. So in our control condition, we have arrows pointing towards the center, and then the target letter is presented at the center, and then the target letter is removed, and you are required to give a response about which letter was presented. So in this particular trial, there's no shift of attention, and there's no shift of an eye movement. It's our control condition. But now we also have cues that either point to the right, point to the left, point to the item that's relatively close, and the item that's relatively long. So if there are 4 arrows presented, you need to make a shift, either a covert or an overt shift towards the more remote item. While there are only 2 arrows presented, you need to make an eye movement to the or intentional shift to the object that's relatively close. Then, in our overt condition, in which you are required to make an eye movement towards the Q location, we present the target letter before the eyes start to move. This is very important to realize, because we are now examining the shift of information, of attention, before the eye starts to move. And when then the eyes land, the letter is already gone. So this is all happening in that interval of the saccade latency, right? This is the sort of traditional premotor type of attention experiment. In our covert condition, we also present the target letter very, very shortly, but the eyes stay at the center. So the difference between the overt and the covert condition is that in the overt condition, you make an eye movement, and the covert condition, you don't make an eye movement. And all of these, both these conditions, there is of course a shift of attention, but in one of these conditions, namely the overt condition, the shift of attention is associated with an eye movement, while in the covert condition, this is not the case. And now the question arises, we have a long waiting time, so we can look at the pupil size, and we can look at how the pupil size changes as a response to these different assignments. Now you can think about yourself. I cannot hold a poll because it's hard for me to see you, but look up for you raise your hands and you can look at each other to see what you think. Do you think that there is more effort associated with the overt condition or the covert condition? So who thinks it's the overt condition that's going to be more effortful? Please raise your hand. And who thinks that the covert condition is going to be more effortful? Okay, let's look at the results. So here, let's first look at the accuracy of the target identification, so the letter, because that's going to be necessary in order to examine whether they're equally difficult. Well, because the pupil also responds to effort, so we need this task to be relatively similar. What you can see that there is a difference between near and far target locations, but not so much between the overt and the covert condition. So it means that we're sort of okay there, right? So the effort is not really a crucial factor here. So here we're going to look at distance. Distance does not affect the pupil size. So that's the distance of the covert shift or the overt shift. For the near or the far location, that's not really a factor, meaning that we can sum them together, and we can just look at the effect of overt versus covert and not take the distance into account. So here is our overt and our covert condition, and what's extremely important to realize is that we now look at the pupil size before the eyes start to move. So you might be wondering there that the pupil size is going to be influenced by the movement of the eye, and that's absolutely correct. So what we're only going to do is we're going to look at the pupil size in the interval in which the eyes haven't moved yet. So 0 is the onset of the target, and there you can see the little horizontal line on the left. That's the start of the eye movement. So we're only going to look at the interval of the saccade latency, so to say. What you can see here is that in the overt condition, in which there is an eye movement that's being executed, the pupil is a lot larger compared to the covert condition. In the covert condition, it's more effortful than a control condition. But I think what's most interesting to focus on is the overt and the covert condition, meaning that in the situation in which you shift your attention but also move your eyes, there's a more effort associated with the covert condition. And what does the cost of a saccade consist of, right? Well, one factor might be you have to prepare the oculomotor muscles to start moving. You have to do all the neural computations associated with making the eye movement. And there's predictive remapping, in that you now have to predict how the world is going to look after you have made an eye movement. So yes, there is a cost associated with making an eye movement, and it's actually larger. And what's interesting to me, at least, is that this can be picked up by looking at the pupil. Okay, are all saccades equally costly? So our next step was to look at different directions of saccades. So we wanted to know whether oblique saccades, which can be assumed to perhaps be requiring more neural populations compared to simply horizontal or vertical saccades, might be more effortful. There's more complex oculomotor program for oblique saccades. So we did a second experiment in which we only had eye movement, and we just look at eye movements in different directions. And we looked at the pupil size in sort of response to the programming of the eye movement in different directions. Target identification accuracy was taken into account because there were some differences there, but those were taken into account when we examined our pupil size in a linear mixed effect model. What that model showed us is that we show a very, very clear effect, and that the oblique saccades are much more effortful compared to horizontal and vertical saccades. I'm telling much more, I cannot really quantify it, but at least the effects were really, really robust, and I think each observer had that effect. So meaning that even the executions of different oculomotor directions, different vectors, not so much the execution, but at least the programming of it, can actually be picked up by the pupil. And to me, this is quite exciting. So planning saccades is more costly than covert shifts of attention. And this difference in cost in part decides whether we choose to move our eyes or only to shift our attention in different situations in daily life. And oblique saccades is more costly than planning saccades in cardinal directions. And this provides a starting point to understand where we decide to move our eyes. And where we decide to move our eyes could therefore partly be influenced by the cost associated with planning that eye movement. So this was highly exciting to us. Luckily, this paper was just accepted in Psychological Science, but I hope you agree that this is this is quite a strong claim, right? That this pupil will determine where the effort is that we can measure with the pupil will determine where we move our eyes. So I'm now going to show you some unpublished data that really speaks to this idea that this might actually be correct. Because in daily life, if you look at natural viewing behavior, we don't make a lot of oblique saccades. So this might actually be the case that there is more difficulty in executing them. So what we did, let me just skip this, is that we had a second experiment in which we showed where we were examining whether expensive saccades are indeed avoided. So what we created was a map, a cost map, so to say. So we just had a very simple experiment in which we had 36 locations, and we asked the observer to make an eye movement, and we cued them to make an eye movement to one of these locations. And we measured the pupil. And this is the pupil size on average, 70 participants. You can see that in our case, downward saccades were more effortful than upward saccades. You can indeed see again that the oblique saccades are also more effortful compared to horizontal saccades. So we have a clear preference map, perhaps in terms of a cost map. But now we can have a preference map. In our same subject, in a different block, we did a different experiment where we presented two items on the screen, and participants can choose themselves to which location they wanted to make an eye movement. So they could just I prefer to go in this direction or in that direction. And then we can have a preference map. So this is a two alternative forced choice tasks in which we just count the saccade preferences across conditions. And this is our outcome, that people prefer making eye movements upwards. They don't prefer the oblique directions. So there are differences, clear differences in what people prefer in this type of task. Now we can look at the overlap between the two maps. And I hope you agree with me that they're highly anti-correlated. So effort underlies saccade preferences, that if we correlate the two, that is clearly a negative correlation, that the locations that are associated with high pupil size, therefore high effort, we believe, are also the ones that you don't prefer to make an eye movement towards. Okay, so the saccade-linked effort determines which saccades are not made. And what we subsequently did is we looked at a data set that was available online. It was a visual search task. And this either had a single or dual auditory MBAC task. So in a one block, people also had to do something in there, load something up in the auditory working memory. And now we wanted to examine, when there's an additional working memory task, whether certain saccades are no longer there because they are effortful. And when you have a working memory load, you want to avoid the effortful saccades. So this is the pupil size across the different directions. We measured the pupil size after the saccade. So this will determine how effortful that saccade was. So it's a little bit different approach to one I previously showed you. And then we just look at the change in directions of the saccade between the dual and the single condition. And you can clearly see, hopefully, that the dual, in the dual condition, some directions are less present compared to the condition in this free viewing task, this search task with natural scenes, in which there was no additional working memory task. And again, these are highly anticorrelated, meaning that the locations that are associated with high pupil size, the directions, those are removed the moment you have an additional working memory task. So how much effort it takes, how much internal storage you have, will determine the directions of an eye movement, the direction. Well, I hope that you agree with me that this trade-off is interesting and that it's something that should be examined further, and that there are a lot of interesting aspects you can look into. We also have a lot of clinical approach where we study patients with memory deficits to see how they perform in these types of tasks. We play around with reward, we play around with punishment. We even have a study on people who are expert puzzle players to see how they use their internal memory. And this is something you do all the time, right? You go outside now out of this room and you start interacting with the world around you, and you make this decision continuously. And every eye movement you make is a largely decided decision about where to make an eye movement towards, which information to store, and also partly then determined by which directions of eye movements are effortless or associated with less effort, in order to minimize the load on our visual working memory, but also to use an eye movement in such a way that they are as less effortful as possible. And with that, I would like to thank the lab here in Utrecht University. And if you have some questions, please let me know.
Um, well, sir, it looks like nobody has any questions as of now, but I'm sure as they read more, they might come up with questions. So maybe it would be okay if they could email you about them.
Sure, absolutely, no problem. Yeah, you can always reach out to me.
Yeah, we'll be sharing your email with them. And we have a group of very diversely interested participants. So, like, I'm sure everybody will be super interested in reading more about visual working memory after today's talk.
Sure.
So, I suppose with that, I'll thank you for your talk, for a really lovely session. It was very interesting to me personally too, because it was new to me. But yeah, we look forward to having you for more of our sessions, maybe sometime in the future. And we hope to see you
Always
soon
welcome.
again. Thank you so much for giving us your time. Yeah, thank you.
Sure. Thanks for inviting me and enjoy your day. And let me know any questions. Bye, guys.